Welcome to episode 7 of Track Records with your hosts, Kenny and Barry. And Barry, I wanted to pick up on you were telling a funny thing about Bruce Springsteen about before he started working out for the Born in the USA tour. The last thing I remember you saying was something about him eating cheeseburgers.
Yeah, when he started working out and being concerned with his health, apparently up to that point, he was just a total fast food junkie and like a 98-pound weakling.
That's what he looked
Uh,
like. So
yeah. And so he made a concerted effort, at least according to him, he made this concerted effort to start taking care of his health, and that's when he got the bulging biceps and that whole Born in the USA era where he looked like a completely different person. Um,
it, it
and
was
I think it was due to working out and not steroids.
it,
I
it
can
was it
only
was
assume.
it was like Linda Hamilton between Terminator 1 and Terminator 2. That was what it was like with
Yes.
Springsteen. It was so funny to see him suddenly change like that. So
Yeah, that's a good analogy. And I got to say, aesthetically, not that it really matters, but I like the 98-pound weakling Springsteen
me
who was
too, because
like,
he was the
the
everyman.
squirrely little punk,
Yeah,
you know.
but I will say, if you're going to perform the way he performs and the length of his shows for as long as he was doing it, I understood why he made that change.
Oh, if he kept on going like he did, I can only imagine he wouldn't be around today and as healthy as he is today. You look at him today, he looks like he's about 10 to 15 years younger than he is. He's totally fit still, and obviously still puts on these marathon shows night after night when he's out touring. Maybe not to the extent of his earlier years, but still, it's pretty impressive.
It's extremely impressive. And again, whatever we think of the Stones' recorded output over the last, many years, what Mick is doing at his age is pretty incredible.
Yeah, it really is. And Keith, for that matter, or
Yep,
Ronnie Wood, they're
yep,
all old farts,
yep.
and they all seem to be in pretty damn good health
Well,
considering their age,
it's
especially Mick.
yeah, but especially Mick. I mean, for what he does on stage and all, it's not like, and no knock on Dylan, because it's still impressive to be performing as long as he has been. But he just sits there, plays guitar, plays harmonica, sings. He's not leaping about the stage the way Mick is. So
No, he isn't. In fact, he looks like he's about ready to fall over at any given
yes,
minute.
but he still keeps going. So
Yeah, the never-ending tour,
yeah,
as he started calling it. I think it was in the early to mid 80s.
80s, yeah,
And I saw him a couple times back then,
same.
86 and 87 at it's a place in Berkeley, the Greek Theater in Berkeley, this great outdoor theater. Only times I've ever seen him. And even at that point, still way past his prime, in my opinion, but still really good. Is
Uh,
that the era you saw him in?
I saw some in like 81 or 82 at the Orphan in Boston. And then Kim and I
Mhm.
saw him at a club in Boston in 2006, 2007. He was great. I mean, like, I agree that like, obviously he wasn't like 60s or 70s Dylan, but, considering that, I thought he was really good. Although it's funny because he was playing 3 nights in a row, and we got there on Friday night, the third night, and I realized right before we were going in that our tickets were for the night before, and I was like, "Oh no!" But it was general admission, so I said, "Okay, Kim, just follow my lead," and we started to go through. We gave them the tickets. They didn't even look, and we started to go through the turnstile, and then they go, "Wait a minute! These tickets were for last night," and I said, "What? No, you got to be kidding! It's you guys who screwed up!" And I'm do this whole thing. They're like, okay, just go in, and so we were able to go in and see the show. So
That's pretty cool.
yeah,
That's great that they actually let you in.
I
I
because it
can
was general
only imagine
admission,
that
I
wouldn't happen.
figured we had a shot. If they were assigned seats, it wouldn't have
St
worked. So
Still, in this day and age,
yeah,
even if they were still GA tickets, they wouldn't let you in.
yeah.
I would bet dollars to donuts.
So
Um,
I really like they knew like I was a maniac, and they were like, okay, you know what? I don't want to deal with this guy, but you're probably right. So
so speaking of Dylan,
yeah,
and circling back to just a second, circling back to one of our earlier topics about bands who've never put out a stinker of a
yeah,
record. Um, or we also had a bit of a sidebar where we start talking about bands who have had like this incredible run
yeah.
of say at least 6 records. But anyway, I wanted to bring up Dylan because I think we both know that the last couple decades have not been his best, and most of those records, at least to me, I find almost unlistenable, just not interesting and shitty. However, the very latest one, it's called Rough and Rowdy Ways,
Yeah.
and I think it came out about 2 years ago, maybe three at this point.
Okay.
Is a great record. It's inarguably his best record, I would say, since maybe oh uh what's the one? God, I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank.
Back in the 80s, like,
Early 90s or
okay.
late 80s, early 90s. The one with
Because like Time Out of Mind.
no, it's before that. I see.
Okay.
I think like Time Out of Mind and Love is Theft or whatever that next one is. I think those are extremely overrated. Anyway, my point being, I was shocked to pick up Dylan's latest record, some 50 years on, and it's really good.
And what made
Really
you pick
good.
it up?
I came across it for really cheap,
Yeah.
and it was
Okay.
this great UK pressing.
Got it.
Sounds good and is good. It's a really good record, in my opinion, for Dylan,
Yeah.
especially at this
Yeah. No,
stage.
I will definitely check that out. I think Dylan had as good of a run of albums back in the 60s as any band or artist has ever had a run. And actually, believe it or not, Blonde on Blonde is my favorite album of all time.
Is it?
Yeah.
I've heard of that.
Yes. Except
I
for,
didn't know
although
that was your favorite.
I will say I'm not a big fan of Rainy Day Women 16 and 35, but other than that, I like every song on the album. Um,
Mhm.
and it's interesting, like, so we were talking about the lyrics versus music, and it's interesting that you would be a Dylan fan or a big Dylan fan, because for Dylan, to me, the big draw would be the lyrics.
Certainly plays a role for me. But if again, if those lyrics didn't have great hooks associated with them, great instrumentation and just great music in general, and I'm talking more about records like Blood on the Tracks or Desire, where I think the music is much more interesting than say some of his earlier stuff.
Yeah, it depends on what
Um,
album it is. So in
yeah,
terms of
John
musical
Wesley
backing,
Harding,
yeah.
um, another one of my faves. So you thought he had this great run of records in the 60s. I would go one further and say that that run went up until the mid 70s
Well,
with a couple exceptions.
and when I'm saying great, I mean like top. So, bringing it all back home, Highway 61 Revisited, Blonde on Blonde. I mean, that's three of the greatest, albums in a row of all time. And, same thing with the Stones with Let It Bleed, Beggar's Banquet, Sticky Fingers and Exile. I don't think
Hmm.
it begins before then for the Stones. I don't think it goes after that, certainly for the Stones. It's that set.
So
Uh,
I would say the three records, I think three before Let It Bleed, being Aftermath,
Aftermath, yeah.
Between the Buttons,
Yeah.
and Their Satanic
Yeah.
Majesties, which always gets panned.
Yeah.
But if you go back and listen to it, it's a great fucking record,
I
in
like
my
all three of
opinion.
those records. Do not get me wrong. I like all three. I definitely like them, and stuff I still listen to today. But there's great, and then there's the pantheon, like the Olympus, and they're
Yeah,
not that. So
I don't think they are as good as what came after, but I think that's when their great run started.
yeah.
I would consider them great, just not as great as a Let It Be or a Beggar's Banquet or
Right.
Sticky
A-
Fingers.
And speaking of that, so you'd said before that if you put it on an album, even if there's a song you don't like, you still let it play. If Do you listen to both sides of an album every time you put on an album?
Oh, almost every time.
Okay, so if you wanted to hear, and we've agreed that the first couple Stones albums are, mainly just filler, but let's say you wanted to hear "Not Fade Away" by the Rolling Stones off their first album, England's Newest Hitmakers, would you put on the album and listen to, in essence, 12 songs you don't want to hear just to hear the one you do?
Yeah, I would, and
Okay.
I wouldn't categorize it as 12 songs I don't want to hear.
Okay.
They just may not be songs that draw me into to pulling out the record in the first place.
Yep.
But yeah, it's very rare that I would pull out a record and just play one song from it. I pretty much it's probably an OCD thing where I just feel like I feel compelled to listen to the whole record
Could be
no
laziness.
matter what.
Could be just
Um
like getting up from the chair.
I don't think it's laziness, because if that were the case, I wouldn't be listening to records at all
Right.
to
No,
begin
no,
with.
I agree.
Because
I'm just,
it's very interactive.
but yeah, but like look, take a record like Making Movies by Dire Straits, where
Mhm.
I think side one is one of the best side ones of all time. I don't think side two is that interesting. And so I would listen to side one and I rarely would flip the record.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, hey, I put it on the artist, you know. And the interesting thing when we touched on who's next before, in terms of just being a better record than Tommy, because I think the songs are just better, and the way they're set up, the way the track listings run is really good. And yet, ironically enough, it wasn't Pete who did it. Pete was burned out by that point on Lifehouse and all that stuff, and it was Glyn Johns, the producer, who really set up.
Pulled it together.
Yeah, and so that when I found that out, I thought that was really interesting, because that's most people I'm sure don't know that, and he should really get a lot of credit for that, because one of the reasons Who's Next works so well is because of the order of the songs. You know,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
I
It's
and I
hard
think
hard to beat that record.
yeah, and I think some records have good songs and don't work as well as they could have because the songs aren't organized correctly.
Hmm. Hmm. Um, Going back again to circling back to a previous topic,
Yep.
one of our earlier podcasts
Yes.
ended when we had just started talking about great concert movies.
Yep.
And the topic originally came up because I was singing the praises of that Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds Distant
Which,
Sky
which I
movie.
now have on my
So
watch list and will be seen this week. So
cool. I'm sorry. I, as usual, I have many frogs in my throat. Just a second. So a couple others that I wanted to mention, because I was on the spot. I was trying to think of other ones that held up as movies, even though they're just the concert of whatever the band is, without a bunch of other stuff spliced in, a la Kids Are All Right, or you know something like that. But anyway, a couple
that is
others
different.
worth.
Yeah.
It is. But I still consider it a music movie,
Oh yeah, no question.
not a concert movie,
And I
but a
love Kids Are
music
Right.
movie.
It's one of my favorite
Yeah,
movies, but it's
it
not.
it
Yeah.
might be the best
Yeah.
music movie ever.
Yes. But
I
they're
I
two
would
different things. Yeah.
argue. But a couple others, and I'm curious as to whether or not you saw these. One was by Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers called Pack Up the Plantation. It
I've
was
not
a
seen that. Yeah.
concert film from '86 when they were touring that. I think what was the name of Southern Accents was the
Yeah.
name of the record. And I look at that era as like a peak for Tom Petty. I think it was a slow decline after that.
Mm,
Have you seen that?
I've not seen that.
Yep. It's really good. It's straight up concert movie. I think it's culled from about two different shows at the same venue. Fantastic. Fantastic from start to finish. Um, Another one would be the Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars, a concert movie that came out in the early 80s, but it
And
was filmed in 72, I think,
yeah,
73 maybe.
yeah. I think it's Santa Monica Civic Auditorium. I like it.
It's in London.
Oh, it's
It's
in London.
Ziggy's uh, good God, Ziggy's retirement show is
Got
what
it.
it
Okay.
was. Remember, he's like, not only is it the last show of this tour, but it's the last show we'll ever do. And the crowd's like, oh. Have you seen that?
I have seen that. It's been a long time since I've seen it. What I remember, one of the things I remember is not loving the quality, wishing the quality were a lot better. Not of the music, of of the recording. But because it was done in 72. But that was really good. David Bowie's released better live albums than a lot of artists. If you like Live at the Tower or Stage, or what they
Yeah.
finally released legally, I used to have as a bootleg, was from Nassau in 1976 for the Station to Station tour. It now comes with a re-release of Station to Station, and man, it is just fantastic. As good as he was in 72, he found his stride in 76, which ironic because he couldn't remember much of 76 afterwards. So
Yeah. Yeah, he's famous for saying he doesn't remember, or he didn't remember the entire 70s.
Yes. So,
That's obviously a slight exaggeration, but a
right.
pretty funny one
Yeah.
considering what he put himself through, um, supposedly with all the drugs and everything. Um, uh, and one other one I wanted to mention, which often gets panned as a concert movie, but I think is really good still as the song remains the same.
Yeah, and I think it's okay. I think considering it was Zeppelin, it should have been better. And there's some sequences in it that just don't work for me. But
The
there's
fantasy
yeah,
sequences,
yeah,
is
stuff
that
like
what you're
that.
talking
Yeah,
about?
yeah. And
Those
that
are pretty short though,
there,
like a couple
but
minutes here or
but
there
but
for
it,
each one for each
but
band member.
yeah, but it's sort of like gets you out of being at the show. For me. And so in part of the problem, song that remains the same is super hyped. And so partly if people were just like, oh, then I'd be more I think I would enjoy it more. Unfortunately, the hype like lessened my enjoyment of it. One of the ones I stumbled across this past year, which I didn't know about, and they're not one of my all-time favorite bands, so I never like dug it out, but was Creedence Clearwater Revival in the Europe tour, and it was good. I was surprised. I was surprised how good it was, and
Are you
actually the
talking
quality was really good, which really
you're
surprised me.
talking about the Royal Albert Hall concert
Yep, yep,
thing on Netflix?
yep,
Yeah, that is fantastic. I watched it too
yeah,
recently because I hadn't had Netflix for a couple years, and anyway, I loved it. You
yeah.
don't get to see. There's not much great old Creedence footage out there.
And that was the thing. And so even though they're not one of my top 10 bands by any means, I certainly like them. But having not seen them, like seen them, live on, in on tape or whatever at all, I was like, wow, they're good. So
Oh man, that and it's the whole show.
yeah,
They are totally on fire, and in particular, a shout out to Doug Clifford, who was the drummer.
yeah.
So my drummer friend and I constantly refer to old rock drummers that we love, and Cosmo, as his nickname is, just shines in that show. He he's so underrated as a drummer, and just he and Fogerty are the key pieces to that band and always were,
I
especially Fogerty, of
I was gonna
course.
say I think it's hard to shine when Fogerty is so the center of the band. He's the singer, he's the writer, he's the musical
And
director. So
and to that point, he was so good as a writer, so good as a vocalist, one of the best rock vocalists ever, and so good as a lead guitarist. It's like, wow, what a package to be that good at all of those things.
it's amazing, particularly when it comes to the writing, to how many hit songs they had. I mean, it's amazing how many they turned out in a short amount of time. They had, yeah, they had the most, I think, most top 10 hits ever without ever having a top number one.
Yeah, that's right. They would usually get to number two.
Yeah, and just kind of funny what stopped them. But I mean, like even like casual people, like casual music fans know, can list a bunch of their hits. I mean, it was amazing, just one after the other, after the other, after the other. I mean,
They
it
were
was like
the
Lennon McCartney. So
Yeah, they were the biggest band on the planet there for about a year or two,
yeah,
68, 69-ish, and they put out four albums
yeah.
in I think just over a year, and chock full of huge hits. And back when uh, a hit didn't necessarily mean it was shitty music like today. The top 40 back then
Yeah,
was chock
it was
full
good.
of
Yeah,
great
although
music.
although it had mixed in like there was some crap mixed in as well. But yeah, otherwise, but yeah, they were sort of an overnight sensation. I mean, they weren't, but like they hit public consciousness sort of out of nowhere with just this like comet, like run of records of those three or four records, and then they sort of disappeared. And it's just amazing to have it like be that prolific in that short amount of time.
Yeah, Fogerty pulled the plug on it.
Yeah.
And actually, for their last record, uh, his brother had quit, so they were just a trio on their last record. And then after that, Fogerty pulled the plug, and I think a lot of it was due to the mistreatment by Sal Zance and Fantasy Records. I'm sure
And
you
that
know
caused a
that whole
huge rift
story.
between Fogerty and the other guys in the band because they ended
Yeah,
up selling out to him, and Fogerty was pissed, and hence the lawsuits and all that, and him even writing a song, "Zance Can't Dance," on one of
yeah,
his solo records as a
on,
shot at him.
on center field.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so
and for a while there, he couldn't even play his own. He didn't own his songs, and he couldn't even play his own songs
yeah,
during that litigation. I think in the late '70s or something like that. Crazy story,
yeah.
and
But
classic story of being fucked over by the music industry.
yeah, and like Springsteen having not being able to record for a couple of years there, while he fought it out in the courts with Mike Appel.
Yeah,
But the interesting thing about John Fogerty is if you would bet your money on anyone to have a hugely successful career after leaving Creedence, considering, you know, he was, 75% of Creedence, he didn't
he didn't what have
have a
a
hugely
successful
successful
career.
solo career. I mean, he definitely like
He,
he no
he
he
did.
no he I mean he did okay, but you would have thought, now in particular with him running the show by himself and doing whatever he wants for his solo albums, you would have thought he'd be dominating the airwaves. And
Like as much as Creedence did,
yeah,
because
that he'd be Springsteen, that he'd be Bob Seger, that he'd be whoever in
mm,
the 70s and 80s, and he wasn't. As a matter of fact, I think Center Field was his first hit song, real hit, since the Creedence stuff.
it was
Yeah,
that record.
and
But that came out, I think, about 10 years after Creedence broke
yeah,
up.
yeah,
He
if
put
not
out two
more.
records.
Yeah,
He'd put out two records shortly after Creedence broke up, and neither of them really did anything.
yeah,
And and then he went for close to 10 years without putting out anything. And that comeback record, Center Field, that had a couple pretty big hits on it. The title cut, and
the title
remember
cut was
old,
was massive, like radio airplay, dominated radio airplay. Plus, it was made for like
Old Man Down
sports.
the Road.
Yeah, and then that as well. Yeah. And that I think was one of the MTV videos. But Center Field was certainly played at. It's still played at baseball, parks to this day. So,
It is.
um, but that's I would have thought he would have had those sort of hits like after leaving, Creedence. Because of what he'd done, and it's sort of like he shot his wad. It's sort of like when Creedence broke up, like he was, burnt out.
Yeah, yeah. It seemingly burnt out because of the industry.
Yeah, and
Took
then
him 10, 15 years
yeah,
to recharge his batteries.
that's a long time. As opposed to Bowie, what the fascinating thing about Bowie is some churning through the different alter egos, identities, as he went through the 70s with Gene Genie and Aladdin Sane, and the Diamond Dogs and the Thin White Duke. I mean, it's one thing to keep releasing records, but to keep changing, you know, who like
Reinventing himself.
yeah, I mean it's just crazy. And
And
he released one of the few albums of covers I've ever actually really liked, which was Pinups. I'm sure you know that album. A lot of
I've
covers of
heard of
really
it.
great early 60s Pink Floyd and, Stones and great stuff. So
The Who.
the Who,
Can't explain
yeah.
in any way, anyhow, anywhere. That is an incredible covers record.
I think most covers records are shite, and I think that one's a really good one. So,
All right,
so
take it easy.
and as far as music movies go, certainly Last Waltz. It breaks up. It's not just a pure concert movie, but it's mainly a concert movie. And it's great. There are issues I definitely have with the way Scorsese did it, but the performances are incredible.
What are your issues with the way it was done?
Just some of the interviews, and once again, one of the fantasy sequence, and but there's other stuff which I thought was interesting. Now, also, it wasn't just the concert. Like a couple of the things they did, they had to do elsewhere, like the Staple Sisters joining them for the Wait. That's not from the concert, even, but it's fantastic. Joni Mitchell singing Coyote. It's still just great. I mean, and as a matter of fact, the band is so good in the Last Waltz that I almost never listen to their studio stuff anymore, which is sort of a shame. But that's how good I think they are. And when they're playing with Ronnie Hawkins, and I love when he turns to Bill Graham and goes, "Big time, Bill, big time." I thought that was nice. That was fun for him. But then with Dylan, with Clapton, I mean, like that is just fire. That movie. So, and I was already a fan of the band, no question, but that made me like, a much bigger fan. And that's the thing about that movies can do, and you don't get a lot of them. Did you ever see? There's a Stones movie. Actually, it's not widely known. It's called Charlie Is My Darling.
Never seen it.
Okay. And it's got some concert footage, and because it's a small film, it's really interesting. As opposed to when Scorsese did what's called Shine a Light with the Rolling Stones at the Beacon Theater.
Ugh,
Yeah, exactly.
ugh,
That's my point. And
ugh.
so a lot of those movies just aren't good, and then some are. Certainly, Bruce in the No Nukes movie, Bruce is said is fantastic. Um, and I love where the crowd's screaming their heads off, Bruce, 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 and the cut backstage to Jackson Brown, who says, turns to someone and says, "Good thing his name wasn't Melvin."
Yeah. Yeah, that's quite witty.
Yes.
Um, a good Stones movie that I'm curious to know if you've seen or not. It's that one that was done by Robert Frank, the famous American photographer, called
Yeah,
Cocksucker Blues.
the 1972 tour.
Mhm.
And I I'm trying to remember. I think I've seen pieces of it, and for some reason, I've not seen the whole thing. I'm quite familiar with how it was made and the battle between whether it would be released or not. And as a matter of fact, the song "Cocksucker Blues" was a song the Stones did, the last song the Stones did to get out of their record contract. Um, and that was also one of my favorite bootleg Rolling Stones songs. There's a great Rolling Stones bootleg set called "The Black Box," which is a 4-disc set, which I had at one point and unfortunately no longer have, and would love to get that back. The demo version of "Jumping Jack Flash" is so much better than the released version. It's just fantastic. Um,
Really?
yeah, um,
Huh, that's
and
hard
so
to believe
so if you
because
can
the
track that
release
down.
version
Yeah,
is
no,
so
and
incredible.
actually that is my favorite Stone song. So the release version I do love, but the demo, and it's good. Mick at the beginning goes go, and then the song begins, and there's something like cool about him doing that. But just it's just different. If you ever get a chance to track that down, definitely worth getting, although expensive.
I'm
But
surprised I've never come across that. I wasn't even aware of it.
yeah, it's called the
I've
Black
got
Box.
the Black Album, which
Yeah,
is
and I
three
think
LP set of the Beatles
yeah, and so
and
I think that was
outtakes,
yeah, and I think that that was a reference to that. Just like there was
probably.
a Blondie boot, like I saw one time called Platinum on Blonde, which
Mhm.
was like a little, tongue in cheek joke.
Yeah.
But the Stones on that 72 tour, I know, I remember for a lot of the shows, Stevie Wonder opened,
Mhm.
and they would close with them doing Uptight together. And man, if there's ever a tour I would love to have been there for, that's a tour I would wish I could have seen.
It's interesting because there's that other, so Cocksucker Blues has a lot of footage from that tour,
Yeah.
as does this other movie, which I know you've seen. It's called Ladies and Gentlemen, the Rolling Stones.
And I've
That
seen
is
that.
just,
Yeah. And
yeah,
that has
pure
some of the
concert
Stevie Wonder
footage.
stuff. Yeah. And so I think I have not seen the Robert Frank movie. I think the stuff I've seen is from the other one, from the concert movie.
And my point about that is you would I that was always one of those holy grail movies for me that I'd wanted to see.
Yeah.
And it was only, till the last few years, it was widely unavailable.
Yeah.
And I saw it. I forget where I saw it, but anyway, I, I was sorely disappointed by it. I found it to be incredibly boring for it to be, a movie based on that 72 tour, which is somewhat legendary, and the movie itself just really drags, and it's just they don't sound very good in my opinion. It's just not very good. I was sorely disappointed.
It's interesting because I mean part of the deal with the movie was at first the Keith and Nick said like film everything, don't worry, like whatever you see you can film and all, and so he did, and then they realized afterwards, maybe that wasn't the smartest idea, and that's why it took the film a while to come out. And so I could imagine being curious to see it and thinking, okay, it's going to show all these drugs and all these groupies and all these various things and all. Is that in there?
That is not, but
Okay.
some of that stuff is in Cocksucker Blues,
No,
where
that's what I'm saying
Keith
in
is
Cocksucker Blues.
obviously.
Yeah.
Oh, I thought you meant the other one.
No, no.
Yeah, in Cocksucker Blues, yeah, there's moments. Well, the movie opens with a shot from above a bed with Mick lying on the bed with his hands down in the front of his pants, massaging his cock and balls.
Yes.
That's the opening shot of the movie. Um, and they're and and by the way, I haven't seen it for probably 30 years. I had this dupe of a dupe of a dupe
Right.
on a beta tape.
Yeah.
That's how I had it.
Got it.
And anyway, there was footage of Keith where he was obviously nodding out. It doesn't show him shooting up or anything, but clearly he's fucked up during the whole thing.
And supposedly originally they said like, yeah, you see him shooting up, basically like you can go ahead and film that. And then they came to their senses afterwards, and realized that was not the brightest idea. And there was never a lawsuit or anything, but there was definitely a battle back and forth before the film was released. So I'd be curious to see an unedited version of that film.
Yeah, that would be. I'm sure that would have some pretty incredible
And,
moments in it.
and then as far as the Stones go, then there was Rock and Roll Circus, where the Stones didn't want to release because they didn't like their performance in it, which was a
Which is
shame
crazy.
because by the time I finally got to see it when it came out, which was 80s, I think, when it was released on
No,
DVD.
maybe it was, but yeah,
Yeah,
it did finally come out,
yeah, and that was
and it's
and there,
incredible.
yeah, and it is incredible, and and actually first in Kids Are Right, seeing the Who doing a quick one while he's away, which once again is so much better than the recorded version. I mean, it is a fantastic version. And and once I saw that in The Kids Are Right, I was dying to see the rest of Rock and Roll Circus. But the
It's it's
Kids Are Right just works so well.
it's funny that the Stones were so hesitant to let that out because of their performance.
Yeah,
You watch their performance now, and it's fantastic.
yeah. I don't know what the issue was.
There's like six songs, and they all sound so good. Brian Jones is, and I don't even know if he was plugged in. He looks like he's barely alive in it.
Yeah,
But for example, the really long extended version of "Sympathy for the Devil," in that where Mick takes off his shirt and he's leaning over and he's got this huge eagle tattoo, faux tattooed on
yeah,
his back. But it was just great to see some live Stones from that era because
yeah.
there's not a lot out there,
No,
and their performance is so good.
because it's stuff like
Go ahead.
the stuff that's available from there is like the Tammy show, which is just a couple. The Stones are only in it for a couple of the
And it's
tracks.
earlier too.
Yeah, and it is earlier. Yeah, and then there's stuff from Hyde Park, which is later. Um,
Mm.
but and the thing is,
Not
no, no,
much,
no,
because that
like
was right
a
after
year,
Brian died.
yeah. And so a year or two later, a year and a half later, it's sad about Brian, because I don't think there could have possibly been a Rolling Stones if it wasn't for Brian Jones. And yet, you want to talk about a short career. Um, but
Yeah, classic rock and roll burnout.
yeah,
So that Rock and Roll Circus movie. So I just want to touch on that
yeah,
because not only are the Stones and the Who great in it, but even lesser bands like Jethro Tull
yeah.
are really fantastic. You could tell Taj Mahal's
Taj
really
Mahal,
good.
yeah,
Even the Dirty Mac supergroup is
yeah,
kind of interesting,
yeah,
especially if you, well, as much as I dislike Yoko
yeah.
and like to talk shit about her, it's kind of anytime you see old footage with her just warbling, standing next to John, I find it pretty amusing.
It was
But
a, certainly interesting. Yeah,
every band was clearly at trying to outdo the other bands. You could
yeah,
just sense it, and that's supposedly the Stones were they felt so blown away by what the Who did
yeah,
that factored into them not wanting it to be
right.
released because they felt like they were overshadowed, which they kind of were.
Yeah, no, I mean the Who just it was an amazing performance. The only artist who didn't come on, like didn't like knock the ball out of the park, but she was great, was Marianne Faithfull. It was a much more subdued performance. So
Yeah, and
singing
there's
something better.
that. There's legend goes that she was like so fucked up on numerous drugs after she performed, and then she was around for the rest of the shoot. And if you see her in the crowd towards the end of the movie, there's, I forget what the song is, but everybody's out there, and
Right.
it looks like a big three-ring circus,
Yeah.
and it looks like she could just barely keep her eyes open. She looks so fucked up,
Um,
and she
and
was such eye candy that it didn't matter what she was doing during her song.
yeah.
She was like, she has such a unearthly beauty to her back
And
then.
I completely agree. Although I really do like the song as well. Something better. And it's interesting because who knows if this is true or not, but supposedly it was really about like her and Mick, because that was basically the end of their relationship. And like, is there something better out there? But I like her her records back then. And it's interesting. Like, you want to talk about a strange comeback in career, coming back with Broken English, which is a phenomenal album. Uh, but obviously could not be more different than her 60s records. Um,
Sure.
but I don't think anyone's had a comeback like her, or Tina Turner, as we've sort of talked about before, in terms of just being totally out of the eye and then coming back, and with a great
Eh,
album, with the great album for Marianne
with,
Faithfull. With Tina, not a great album or musically as far as we're concerned, but certainly financially, you know.
yeah, and level of popularity for
Yeah,
sure.
I mean, massive
Tina was
album.
never more popular
Yeah,
than that.
even though
And
her stuff with Ike is so much better. So
yeah, Aerosmith would be another band who falls into that category. Not creatively, obviously, because when they came back, they put out such shit record after shit record.
yeah,
Um, but God, it was weird how they were basically dead and buried, and then came back and had more commercial success than they'd ever had. And they
yeah,
were huge in the 70s.
right. But like crap, like Janie's Got a Gun, Love in an Elevator, all that stuff. Yeah, but yeah, it was really
So
popular.
depressing.
Yeah, and
So
it's interesting.
depressing.
Then there's a band like Jay Giles, where all their 70s records are these hard-hitting blues, blues rock records. And then when they became super successful, their music was much more pop.
Pop.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you know,
Center field.
Love Stinks, Freeze Frame.
Yeah. Yeah. And those aren't bad records,
No,
in my
no, I enjoy
opinion.
him.
Not like the Aerosmith records.
No, no, I very much enjoy those Jay Giles records, but it's just funny because if you compare those records to, like, their live album Blow Your Face Out, for example, you're like, wait, is this the same band? You know, and then of course the Bee Gees, going from their 60s songs to to their disco hits. I mean, that's an amazing like change, and they were super popular in the 60s with with stuff like Massachusetts and I Started a Joke and Lonely Nights, and then suddenly super, and then they're gone totally out of the picture. No one's knows who they are, where they are, and they come back and they're 10 times bigger than they were before.
What a transformation.
Yeah, I
And
mean,
I love both eras.
yeah,
That's
it,
a
it's
perfect
crazy.
example of a band I would never admit liking
Yeah,
back when I was, say, 17.
yeah,
Um, but I have virtually every one of their records, except for maybe a couple of the last few in the 90s. But and they're all great.
yeah.
Whether it's the early pop stuff or the disco stuff, they all hold up. Those guys were amazing.
And the documentary on them, How Can You Mend a Broken Heart? If you haven't seen that, that's definitely worth seeing.
Is that the one on HBO?
Yeah,
Yeah, I've seen it then.
yeah. So that's really worth it. But yeah, I mean, just interesting bands like that, because most bands, once they're gone, they're gone, and or come back and maybe have like a modicum of success. But to come back and reinvent yourself and be a totally different, and be that successful is amazing.
It's a rare bird indeed.
Yeah.
And Bowie was the king of it.
Yeah. And you look at
Um,
Pink Floyd. Their later records are so much different than their first two albums.
yeah,
Piper at
yeah,
the Gates of Dawn and Saucer Full of Secrets are quite different than anything else they did.
yes.
Uh,
Um,
and, and I
I
like.
want.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to mention a couple acts who maybe they didn't never put out a bad record, but they certainly had a run of just classic records, much like the Stones we were talking about.
Yeah,
There's a lot of the great classic artists have easily put out 6 records in a row that are really good, and some of these, like for example, the Ramones. You know, their
Right. But
first six records you could say are all really good.
right. And I was just when I was saying before about Dylan, for example, or the Stones, was there's a difference in really good versus, some of the greatest albums ever. There's like those Ramones albums are all really good. I really like every single one, but there's no Ramones record where I say that's one of the greatest albums ever made.
Um,